welcome to our Long Coleoptile Wheat webinar, everyone. Thanks for coming. We might have a few more people trickle in as we go, but we'll just get the ball rolling. For those who don't know me, I'm Caroline, and I'm a Research and Extension Officer for FarmLink. And we've got Sarah Rich here from CSIRO, who will be presenting today. Just a bit of a quick housekeeping sort of thing. This webinar is being recorded for future use, so you guys aren't using your screens, but anyone who is going to use their screen, just be aware that we're going to record this. So keep your questions till the end. We'll be happy to chat through some things, have a bit of a discussion as well. So yeah, fire away. But besides that, on to Sarah.
Oh, okay. I will just share my screen and fingers crossed we'll get this happening correctly. Oops. Yep, and then if I presenting and okay, so everyone can see my title slide. We're all happy?
Yep.
Good. Okay, so thanks, Caroline. So I'm Sarah. I work for CSIRO and I'm actually based in Western Australia. But deep sowing is something that's relevant everywhere. And so we've been working nationally on it, and I've been working with a bunch of different researchers from grower groups and DPIs and CSIRO over east. So hopefully everything I've got to say is relevant across the board. A lot of it is pretty general background about the fit for deep sowing. So yeah, we should be going okay. So I'm just going to start by just sort of talking about deep sowing and what scenarios might actually benefit from deep sowing. And so deep sowing gets thrown around a lot, but it really is contextual. So I know GRDC's just had a large investment in pre-breeding for deep sowing canola. And obviously for canola, you're talking about, 30 mils as deep sowing or 40 mils as deep sowing. And yet then there's a lot of guys in Queensland who are putting their chickpeas in at more like 150 millimetres. So it is contextual. So I'll probably define what kind of depths I'm talking about as I talk about it, because I think it's really important. In terms of where deep sowing can have a benefit, probably the thing that gets the most attention around deep sowing is for moisture seeking. So what this means is where you've got a dry surface layer where you'd normally be sowing. So in terms of wheat, if that kind of 30 to 40 millimetre range is dry, but there is actually moisture at depth, we consider that moisture seeking. And so this can come from patchy breaks or later breaks. So the graph I've got up on the screens from some work Bonnie Fleur did a couple of years ago, and it's looking about the fact that across the board, across Australia, breaks are kind of changing. I think she was defining the break as about 30 mils over a couple of days. And so for a lot of growers, particularly as programs get bigger, knowing where that break is and being able to sow around that break, even if the moisture is not quite there, is really important. And so in places like the Riverina, where you are getting those summer rainfall events, often there is moisture down at depth, even if it is dry on the surface. And so this obviously ties into the early sowing window. So that would be around where you're wanting to get in for your longer wheats in April, but that break hasn't come yet. Or you got a really big dump in, say, February or March, but there hasn't been much rainfall since then. And there also can be a bit of a fit. It's less common over east, but in the west, where you get a really good break early in the season, but then you might have 6 weeks following it of warm weather with no rainfall. So depending on the size of your program, by the time you get into the end of your program after the break, those surface soils have actually dried out. And so then you can moisture seek later in the season as well. And the other fit for moisture seeking is around non-wetting sands. And I'll show you some data of a trial on non-wetting sand later. And this is a fantastic fit where that early moisture is sitting a bit deeper, but it has dried out on top. And even if you get small rainfall events following up on some good moisture, they just don't go into the non-wetting sand. So you can get that fit there. Another scenario which gets a little less attention, but I actually think has an amazing fit for long coleoptiles, and I think for a lot of people, these kind of more risk mitigation strategies for deeper sowing can be amazing. So having a crop that can get up from depth can be amazing if furrow fill is an issue. So the photo I've got up on the screen there is after a really big blow in Western Australia in 2020. It happened just after seeding. It was kind of the 20th of May or something. So for a lot of growers, particularly on the sandier soils that we've got here, the furrow's totally filled, and suddenly the seed that you'd put in perfectly was sitting under an extra 40, 50, at times 60 millimetres of sand. And so having a crop that can get up from depth just helps mitigate that patchy or non-existent emergence you'd get after an issue like that. And the same can go for soils where depth control is an issue. And for most of us, that would be around on the ameliorated soils. So if you've, say, delved and everything's a lot fluffier and depth control's harder, or you're sinking it a bit deeper, or if, say, you've ripped and you just end up with uneven depth control as you move along the field over the rip lines, you can find that being able to get up from depth can just even out your emergence in those situations. And then I've got two here, and I put them with a question mark, not because I don't think that they've got an amazing fit for the system, but just because there's a little less kind of work that's been done and trials that have been done around them. And so one of those is phytotoxicity of pre-emergent herbicides. And I think this is something that's really growing in relevance. You know, as resistance grows and the chemicals we're using can be a bit nastier, and particularly on those root actives. Like I know Overwatch, I think, has a recommended sowing depth for cereals after you've used it of 30 or 40 mils. And that can only be getting more. There can be a real benefit to being able to sow in a bit deeper and just get that good separation from whatever pre-emergence you've used. And the same goes for disease. And there's a large GRDC investment in Long Coleoptiles, and these are two of the things they're looking at. I know that disease, they've got some trials in this year, and I don't know any of the results of them yet, but there is a feeling that potentially being able to sow deeper below where that layer of potential disease inoculated soil is could be really beneficial for avoiding particularly some of those sort of root and below ground borne diseases. So what can you sow deeper than 50 millimetres? So the talk's mostly going to be on Long Coleoptiles, but I just want to touch the pulses. This isn't news to most people, but for most of the pulses, so anything with what they call hypergeal germination, where the seed stays below ground and the shoot just pushes up. So that's your fabers, your field peas, chickpeas, vetch, lentil. Any of these can go in easily, and 100 millimetres isn't a rough trot for these, and they will come up with no drop in emergence number and therefore no loss in yield at all. And also I just wanted to highlight that lupins 100% you cannot sow deep. They have a different type of emergence where they have to just push that seed and those cotyledons, the seed leaves, up, and they just won't emerge from depth. Another one I'm not going to talk about much today, but I think is a really exciting new work that's happening, is looking at oats. So oats have a coleoptile plus a mesocotyl, so basically it's even more than the long coleoptile wheats I'll be talking about. And there's some really exciting work happening. So if you're an oat grower or interested in oats, this is something where you can follow along. Intergrain are doing a bunch of work in that. Basically, a lot of it's out of WA. So Alan Raddy's one of the oat breeders there. But if you follow along with him, I've just put some Twitter posts up here. Alexander works with him, and Angel's one of the students. They're getting some absolutely amazing results with deep sowing oats. So it's something that I think has a lot of potential. I mean, you think of the fit in the system around early sowing, oats could really be the next big thing in talking about deep sowing. But long coleoptile wheats are the other thing you can sow deep, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on for the rest of the talk here today. So as a starting point, I just want to define what the coleoptile is. I think it's a word that's been thrown around a lot, particularly over the last couple of years. It's starting to appear on variety sheets, but I think for a lot of people there's not much clarity about what it actually is. And essentially it's just a sheath that protects the emerging first leaf and helps it push through the soil. So that central picture with the bright pink depth gauge, you can see there's two coleoptiles there. So the leaf hasn't emerged from it, and you see they've kind of got this nice point, and that's quite strong and can really help push through the soil. And so the coleoptile basically grows to the length it can, and you can see from the big picture on the side, it then splits open and that first leaf then emerges through. And so obviously it grows as it can, but I think something I want to highlight here is it's also light sensitive. So pretty much as soon as the coleoptile emerges through the soil and senses light, it stops growing and the first leaf comes out. So even that long variety I've got there with a 90 millimetre coleoptile, if you planted it, you know, at 1 or 2 centimetres deep, as soon as it emerged through the soil, the coleoptile would stop growing, the first leaf would come out, and then you just have your seedling establishing as normal. Once the coleoptile reaches its end length underneath the soil, the first leaf will emerge. And so depending on your soil type, what you can get is situations like this. And this really highlights the importance of the coleoptile. So if you're in a light sand and the coleoptile finishes maybe like 10 or 15 mils below, the first leaf will push through fine, but the first leaf really lacks the strength that the coleoptile has. So you can see in these pictures here, these are on like a heavy compacting kind of sandy loam in Victoria. and they went in really deep, and you can see that they just haven't managed to get out. That first leaf isn't strong enough. You know, the coleoptile's gone up as far as it can, but as soon as it ends, the leaf just isn't strong enough to actually push through the soil. And so that really highlights the importance of the coleoptile for emergence if you're sowing deep. So I just want to talk about what impacts coleoptile length. And obviously the first thing, and probably the most important thing, is genetics. So all the old wheats we had used to have long coleoptiles, but they also were really tall, often lodged, and didn't have great yields. And so with the Green Revolution, where breeders really selected for plants that were going to have less biomass and were a lot shorter and therefore had greater yields, they used these height-reducing genes, so these RHT genes. And you can see from the graph on the side, these height-reducing genes, as well as reducing the height of the wheat and the biomass, which was great in terms of lots of our yield benefits and not lodging, they also reduced the length of the coleoptile. So the most common genes that we used reduced the coleoptile length by sort of 3 to 5 centimetres. It didn't really matter because no one was that interested in sowing deep. If you're putting your wheat in at 30 or 40 mils, it makes no difference. They still all got up fine. But obviously now we've started looking at long coleoptiles and sowing deeper for all these other system benefits. It became an issue. Fortunately, there's a whole stack of RHT genes, of height-reducing genes, which still have the same impact of reducing the plant height, but they don't actually affect the coleoptile length, or if they do, it's a far more minimal effect. And so these are the genes that breeders are working with now to try and get back into elite wheats. Like obviously we don't want to lose the yield and disease-resistant benefits that we've got, but to try and get these genes back in to get the longer coleoptile. And just as a little demonstration of how powerful these genes are, this is an experiment that Greg Rubatsky did in Canberra. And basically it's looking at a bunch of wheats that had these dwarfing genes that did reduce coleoptile length, and replacing it with RHT18, which is just one of the genes that doesn't reduce coleoptile length, but still reduces the overall plant length. And so these plants standardly had coleoptile lengths of about 60 millimetres, but with the RHT18 gene, that jumps up by about 30 millimetres. So it's a huge increase in coleoptile length that you're getting just from genetics alone. So this also will give you an explanation if you're ever at a field trial around long coleoptiles, as often you'll find that there's these pairs, YIP-P and YIP-P18 or MACE and MACE18. Basically the 18 is just referencing the RHT gene that's gone in. And you can see from this picture here, everything else about these lines are exactly the same. It's just MACE apart from that gene. And so you can see the coleoptile length on MACE is sitting there around sort of 70 mil, whereas with that genetics, with that RHT18 gene, the coleoptile length's jumped up to around 120 millimetres, so far longer. Obviously, genetics it's not just one gene that's powered over everything. There's a whole suite of things happening there, and that's why we get coleoptile length variation amongst the lines. So this just shows a bunch of lines with coleoptile lengths measured at 15 degrees in the lab, and so you can see some of them really are quite long, and then there's a reduction as it goes down, and you get a lot of variation there. And this brings me to the next thing that impacts coleoptile length, which is temperature. And this is why it's so important to know this, because the fit for early sowing is into warmer soils, and basically the warmer the soil is, the shorter the coleoptile will be. So if you're sowing like in late June into really cold soils, even lines that typically are kind of thought of as shorter coleoptile will actually have quite a long coleoptile that they can get up from, you know, depths deeper than most people are sowing. But for that early fit early in the season, where the soils are quite warm, the coleoptile lengths will be reduced by warmer soils. I mean, this is only at 20. The reduction's far more if you're into soils that are sometimes tipping into, 25 or 30 during the day. And so that's where having those genetics for really long coleoptiles is really important. And then the third thing that impacts coleoptile length, like everything to do with germination and seedling emergence, it comes down to seed size and seed quality. So obviously the quality of the seed you've got and the quality of the maternal environment for that seed is going to lead to the quality of the seedling you get. So this graph here just shows coleoptile length from very small seeds up to quite large, so 25 milligram up to 45 milligram seeds. And we found that for every 10 milligram increase in grain weight, coleoptile length increases by about 5 mils. And the same goes for coleoptile diameter. So obviously coleoptile diameter is important in terms of the strength to push through the soil and actually be able to get out. And so we found with these that for every 10 milligram increase in grain weight, you do get about a 0.1 millimetre or 10% increase in diameter, which can make a big difference for pushing out through the soils. And this is just an example here, just showing, obviously you can't see diameter, but you can see length of some really small seeds heading up to some quite large seeds. And you can see there's just this obvious extension of coleoptiles there. Oops, I think I've clicked on the wrong screen now. And so seed quality obviously also plays a role. This is an example of pinched to plump grain. And once again, the plumper, better quality seed is going to have a longer coleoptile and a thicker coleoptile as well. So that's just a whole general background on some deep sowing and the fit and long coleoptiles. So hopefully we're all kind of at the same point of what we're focusing on there. I just want to present a little bit of data now, and all the data from these trials is going to be pulled from a future drought-funded project where I've been running trials this year. The trials have got, there's a whole bunch of different things we've been looking at, but in terms of what I'm showing today, I'm looking at trials that have been at 6 locations, kind of across the southern and western grain growing regions, and they've all been looking at depth of sowing. And the emphasis of these trials was less on kind of on looking at the genetics or anything behind it, but more actually going, if you were a grower or you had clients that were interested in deep sowing and they wanted to have stuff or to have those longer coleoptiles for those risk mitigation strategies I was talking about, what's actually available right now that you could grow that has this. So there's a lot of talk about what's coming, but I wanted to see what was actually out there now and how they were performing. So the trials have got 12 commercial varieties that I used across them. They weren't all ones that were marketed as longer is what a lot of people say. There's not much definition around coleoptile lengths often in variety sheets. I had a few shorter ones like Mace and Scepter in there just to kind of add a bit of variation so we could see what the impact was. I also had pulse demos and stubble treatments, times of sowing and soil type, but the main thing we were really looking is just how these emerged from depths. So given that I'm assuming that most of you are from the FarmLink catchment, I'll start by looking at the trial we had in Temora, which was run by FarmLink. So it had a stubble treatment. We were hoping to get some differences in soil moisture, but given the really wet start that we had to the season, we ended up with no difference at all between our stubble treatments. And in this trial, we did struggle a little bit to get down to depths, but I've managed to knock off anything that was not very deep. Luckily, Caroline and her team spent a long time digging up individual plants from all the plots, so we know exactly the depths that all the plots went in at. So the data I'm presenting here, so it was a mid-May sowing, and this is 6-week emergence data, how many plants per square metre we're getting. The light green is a standard sowing of about 30 mils, and the dark green is what we've gone at, the depths we got to, which wasn't extremely deep. We got to about 50 to 80 mils across the plots at this trial site, but it's still obviously far deeper than people are standardly sowing. And I think it's really telling in terms of the depth that you might want to sow if you are just wanting to get some of that separation, 50 mils from your pre-emergence, or you do end up with a couple of, 10 or 20 mils of furrow fill in there. And what you can see in this trial, pretty much all the lines, regardless of coleoptile length, emerged amazingly well from these depths, and there wasn't actually any significant difference from that deep and shallow sowing. So I also want to show you some data of a trial that ended up going in quite a lot deeper. So this is from Narrogin, which is in Western Australia. It's a kind of medium rainfall area in the sort of south-central WA. It had a late April sowing, and it also went into a full profile because they had a really good early breakdown there this year. And what you can see is I've structured this graph along the coleoptile length. So the blue on the bottom is coleoptile lengths. You can see they run from Bale and Jewel and Cutlass and Magenta, which are these real longer coleoptiles, going down through to Valiant, Scepter and Avenger, which are shorter coleoptiles. And while everything got up, obviously all the shallow sowing in the pale green again are about 40 mil, got up really well. You can see that the longer coleoptile lines, they all emerged at probably about, it ended up being about 80% of the number of emerged plants at 6 weeks as to the shallow sowing. And while it's hard to know whether that will take a small hit in yield, we'll see when we get to the end of the season, it's pretty impressive, particularly compared to those shorter coleoptile lines, or moderate coleoptile lines. There's a bit of variation there, which really only came up at about 50% of the number of those in the shallow sown plots. So there's obviously going to be a huge hit in terms of yield and also potentially issues in terms of weed cover there compared to those longer coleoptile lines, which as they've got older, those plots have filled out and you can't actually even really tell the difference between the shallow and deep sown of those longer coleoptile lines. So both the examples I've shown, so the one from Temora and the one from Narrogin, were sown into a full profile. And I want to highlight that that's not the situation you would ever choose to deep sow. So deep sowing is something you do if there's a real good reason to do it. If you've got a full profile or even a massive, rain forecast within like a few days of sowing, there'd be no reason to chase moisture and go in deep. Deep sowing is always going to be more stressful on the seed and on the emerging seedling than just sowing shallow. But obviously when you're planning trials, it's, you can't set the season. So we did sow these into a full profile. But I wanted to show this example, which is in Butte in South Australia, so a couple of hours out of Adelaide, and it was a late April sowing as well. And it went in onto a non-wetting sand. And so what was exciting about this trial is it actually was that moisture chasing opportunity where deep sowing would be a management strategy that would be advisable to take here, because at the shallow sowing, which given this was a really soft sand, actually ended up being about 60 mils anyway, so it's questionable whether people would count that as shallow. So we had a soil moisture of about 2% when we sowed, and the deep sowing went into soil moisture of about 7%. And so what we found here was that across the board, all of the lines performed better from deep sowing. But once again, you can see those longer coleoptile lines outperformed the medium coleoptile lines in terms of emerging. So they were in at about 110, emerging from depth from the sand. And not only that, so once again, these are the counts at 6 weeks. So they're just comparative counts. But I wanted to show you this line graph is days since sowing. So we actually did counts at 2, 4, and 6 weeks. This is an example just of Bale, which is one of Longreach's ornless lines, which they promote as being a long coleoptile line. And so you can see in the dark line there, that's your deep sowing. And you can see that it just jumped up. By about 2 weeks, everything was up and it was sitting really solid. The dark black line across it is 140 plants per square metre, which was what we were actually, how much seed we put in. So that was what we're aiming for. And the deep sowing lines got there really quickly. Whereas you can see the shallow sowing depth on this non-wetting soil where there was patchy bits of moisture, it dribbed and dragged through, and they've been slowly filling out, but they've never actually quite got to the point of the deep sowing lines over time. So for non-wetting sands, if you do have moisture at depth, deep sowing can be an amazing fit for the system. I just wanted to highlight that there's variability in soil types. So the reason I put this drone shot up, this is a drone shot at 5 weeks of a trial I've got on a really heavy red clay in the northern grain belt of Western Australia. And the reason I put this up is the rows obviously all are either deep or shallow sown. And I found from a drone photo what was amazing at this site was you really could hardly tell the difference between what was deep and shallow. So I've just highlighted the deep line. So these were in at 100 millimetres. And I was the host farmer of this trial really wanted to push it onto a really heavy soil. And I was pretty tentative because I felt like stuff wasn't going to come up that well from soil this heavy. But it's performed really impressively. Obviously, there's some plots where that fill and that coverage has been far less, but I would assume that they're the shorter coleoptile lines, whereas most of the lines in this trial have come up really well when you look at the data. I just want to show another picture. This is from Victoria on the right, I guess from yours. You can see there's a couple of plots which are shallow sown, so they've obviously emerged really well. This trial ended up going in really deep, and it's quite a solid, cloddy soil. And so the 2 plots you can see on the left there really highlight the power of the long coleoptile. So you've got Bale once again at the front here with that really long coleoptile. And at the back, you've got one of those shorter coleoptile lines. It's actually Valiant back there, which has really struggled to emerge from depth. And so to me, the comparison there of the power of that long coleoptile to help them get out from depth is pretty stark. There. So I'll just wrap up. I'm trying to keep it under half an hour so no one gets too vague and bored on me. So basically the dwarfing genes that we're working with really give the capacity to improve crop establishment. So the Long Coleoptile has a huge power to give us the ability to sow at greater depths. And that moisture seeking really has this benefit and this fit around early season sowing. There may be a benefit late in season, but it's more around those longer season type varieties. And I also wanted to highlight again that you only should deep sow if there's a benefit. So if you've got the shallow moisture, there's no reason to be deep sowing. And that just because you have something that's a long coleoptile wheat, it doesn't mean you have to sow it deep. Long coleoptile wheats do just as successfully from shallow sowing. And that's kind of where I see that potentially this is going to come into the system, is that elite wheats will just end up having long coleoptile as part of the package. And so it's more that risk mitigation for most people, where if they do get furrow fill or a big blow, or your depth control isn't quite as good as you had planned, you'll still have really solid emergence. And in certain cases, depends on where you are, that moisture seeking and deep sowing could be something that you undertake. And so varieties are a whole package of traits. I mentioned bale in here as a line which has performed really well in my trials. It's an ornless wheat, but it's a long season wheat. And obviously, like any variety, you're wanting to pick the fit that fits for the farm and the system that you're working with. And so at the moment, breeding companies are actively working with coleoptile lengths to try and get them coming out. And apparently the rumour is that they'll end up in the NBTs within the next year or two. But obviously for breeding companies, it's about getting that long coleoptile genetics in there, but also making sure that there's really high grain quality and disease resistance that's still there, and also that's a solid agronomy package behind it. So the GRDC is investing heavily in this space at the moment. They've just funded a large 5-year project, which is national. And part of what that is trying to work out some of this agronomy. So for a lot of our trials, we're just putting the seed and the fert down the same chute and effort on a plot seeder to get them in deep enough. And obviously there can be toxicity issues around that. So there's work being done on fertiliser placement. There's work being done around those disease and around preamps. And one of the things that I think is really key that project is doing is working on a standardised tool for whole industry use. I found in this project, when I was trying to look at commercial lines and coleoptile length, a lot of sheets either don't mention coleoptile length at all, or if they do, they just say it has a longer coleoptile or a sought after moderate coleoptile. And that's kind of meaningless because you have no idea what that means in terms of length. So the project's developed a tool so that breeding companies, if everyone agrees to it, could measure coleoptiles under the same standardised protocol, and then everyone would know what they were looking at, and that would also come with a recommended depth of sowing. So as a grower, you actually have confidence of what a longer coleoptile actually means and what that could actually be sown as. So I'll wrap up there. Obviously, there's a lot of grower groups and consultants who've been involved in the project and the trials, and I'm happy to take questions now. And while you're sitting there, you want to scan your phone over this barcode and do a quick survey. It's totally anonymous and it's all multiple choice, so it literally will only take you a minute or two. But one of the key things in it is a question about where I think you can name your top 3 research gaps and the things that you're interested in around deep sowing and long coleoptile wheats, and what you would need to know to actually have confidence to tell clients that you could sow deep. And that data will be fed into the GRDC project to try and, so we really want to be, there's so many things to know about deep sowing. We really want to make sure that we're solving the most important to the people on the ground. And yeah, thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions? Oh, yep, Nicole. So Nicole's just asked how many years of the trial's been done at FarmLink and other sites. So as part of the Future Drought Fund project that I've been talking about today, this has just been a single year of trials that have been done. However, a bunch of different groups have been working on long coleoptiles for years. So there's been field trials carried out for the last 5 to 10 years. A lot of them have been based in the east, but there's now a whole bunch of projects happening, and they're actually at the point, I know in Western Australia, not last year but the year before, we actually ran grower trials of deep sown wheat. So we were actually getting them put out with a full-sized seeder to see where we could get there, and they were really successful. So there's been a range of trials, and the GRDC project I mentioned is a 5-year project, so it's got another 4 years of trials that have been going, And that's following up on a smaller investment they had just in Western Australia, which did, I think, 2 years of trials. So, yeah, there's quite a lot happening in the long coleoptile space.
If no one else has a question, Sarah, I might just ask one. That non-wetting sands, I think, showed exactly what we were looking for in terms of chasing moisture in a drier environment.
Yeah,
we obviously had 300 mils of rain before the seed even saw the soil. So did you have a number of sites where you were able to see that moisture-seeking, moisture-chasing sort of relationship?
Disappointingly, well, it's funny working in this kind of thing, because what I'm hoping for is not what the farmers are hoping for. So this year it was actually only one of the 7 trials ended up having that moisture chasing opportunity. Everywhere else actually went into a full profile, which was a bit disappointing, but I think still very well illustrates the ability for these lines to get up from depth. I do know there's a researcher who at CSIRO in Adelaide, and so she's been working on a bunch of trials and actually trying to actively manipulate her trial sites through irrigation and rain out shelters to get these situations so that we can fully test it, because obviously that's where the benefit really lies, and that's the best demonstration, because that's when you would do it. Like, all the trials that I send to a full profile is not necessarily the recommended management type. Yeah. Did you have your hand up, Frank? I'm not sure. I find Zoom somewhat confusing, as people do.
Yeah, I just had a question. Like, from experience, I used to have a rule of thumb when we had poor establishment with crops, roughly working on 30,000 seeds per kilo. If we had 3 seeds per square metre established, was equivalent in my book to 1 kilo of seed established. And if we had 45 plants, it was equivalent to 15 kilos to make decisions on re-sow. I just didn't see any sort of sowing rates or seed, target plant populations relating to your actual establishment.
Oh, okay, yeah. So the target rate, so at the Temora site, the target rates were 130 plants per square metre. So even our shallow sites didn't establish quite as well as we'd hoped. Across the board, I kind of tended to go with what was standard in the area. So my trials kind of ranged from 120 plants per square metre up to 140, depending on where we were. So, yeah, I should have actually mentioned, I think a lot of the graphs had that black line, which was the aimed target on them. But, yeah, so, I mean, usually you end up with slightly less than what you're aiming for, but most of them established pretty well. Temora was actually one of the less well established, but I'm not sure if that was partially because it really had been so wet, and I think anything that wasn't pretty tough easily could have rotted out. I don't know if there were any below ground issues with emergence. So I just saw your question, Nicole, about whether this trial will continue at FarmLink for the next 5 years. No, so this project unfortunately is a really short one. It was more about a year. It's only unfortunate, strange timing as well, that they timed it so we should have been able to get 2 seasons in, but the way the funding worked, we could only get 1 season in. And I'm not involved in the large GRDC project, so I'm unsure if they have a FarmLink wing or not, but I know they might in the future. So I do know they have trial sites in New South Wales though, but I'm unsure of where those are located and what their future plans are.
Beauty. Thank you very much, everyone, for spending half an hour with us chatting about wheat. And as Sarah mentioned, there's different ways you can get in contact with us, and we've got our FarmLink Open Day on the 8th of September, which Sarah will be speaking at our trial site as well, so you can see everything firsthand there.